So we're going to bring on two more panelists now we're going to discuss some areas that Henner's covered off there and some of their operations as well. So can I bring on Dr. Matthias Preuß, who's Vice President the Global Microfactory Technology for e.GO Mobile. He's responsible for the company's strategy for global manufacturing, including the car maker's existing microfactory in Aachen in Germany and planned facility in Bulgaria. So, Matthias, can I bring you to the stage? Thank you.
Hi, yeah. Hi. Thank you for having me.
And I'd also like to bring up Cengiz Kazilkan, who's President Global Sales Automation Executive Director for Europe for Magswitch Technologies. Cengiz has worked with Magswitch since 2012 and established their European subsidiary. He has a lot of experience in the area of body and white manufacturing and over 20 years of experience in the industry, including working in China and US within supplier and OEM organizations. So, Cengiz, can I bring you to the stage, please? Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, the title of this particular section of the stage is Managing an Uncertain Future, and from that last presentation, that is clearly the case. Cengiz, you're obviously working with OEMs and tier suppliers as well on an equipment supply level. I know, speaking to you, you're working in various factories in conversations with them, so you'll have some insights into how maybe they're reacting to this. And Matthias, with e.GO, you've got a very specific business model and technology. So it'd be interesting to get some insights into that and your views on this. But one of the things kind of, I mean, I'm not sure if it's an impossible question or an impossible term, but I mean, managing these, to say they're short-term challenges, I mean, the energy crisis is kind of something that's unavoidable, but it's the perfect storm at the moment with the transition to electric vehicles and the enormous amount of investment that's been promised, if not necessarily going to be now delivered, in transitioning to that and adapting plants. The vehicle makers can no longer do long-term planning, and by extension, nor can tier suppliers and the equipment suppliers. It just becomes an extremely difficult problem. So in terms of short-term challenges, you mentioned, Henner, that there are cars that are currently part-built because of supply chain issues. How did you see the industry mitigating some of these challenges as far as they possibly can? Asking you for a solution.
Yes. No, we were actually quite surprised. If everybody remembers the earthquake of Fukushima many years back, where we had the same supply problems already. A chip factory 20 kilometers next of the Fukushima power plant, and suddenly we had Mercedes vehicles standing in the plant because the sensors were missing to move the monitors up and down the dashboard. And everybody afterwards promised, we want to understand our supply chain, we want to invest. And then they saw the bill, what it would cost to go deep into the supply chain. And yeah, it faded off. Toyota actually was one of the few who really invested in it. Interestingly enough, they're struggling now as well, or it's more their suppliers into various tiers which are now struggling. I think, yeah, you have to be more flexible and to have more to standardize. This is one of the ambitions which we're seeing, but it's easier said than done. On a chip, what is a chip, right? You have from big chips to small chips, different units, you have different functions. Some are analog, some are more complex, some have to do certain intelligent things. It's not that you can just buy one chip for the entire auto industry. Right? This is a little bit what some of these working groups are trying to suggest, but it's easier said than done to standardize chips. In theory, it would be a beautiful concept, just to take the chip topic. Then you could actually come to the semiconductor industry and not just asking for 100,000 or 200,000, because there you're somewhere in ranking number 100 and below on their priority list. You could then at least buy in millions or a couple millions to have the scale and the power towards that industry. But it is very, very difficult. And again, a cost question. So for example, one of the shortages we're seeing right now is analog chips, small ones, cents. You're not going to take 2-3 euro chips and replace them with it because it's standardized. And maybe you get a little bit better price, but yeah, the amount of chips is thousands of those you have in the car. And it is very difficult. I think you have to, what we suggest, especially to our supply customers, you have to be flexible, you have to agile, and you have to track continuously. You have to adjust your planning pretty much rolling. You can't just sit down, do a one-year plan, and then revisit after half year and wonder why your plan is here and the market is there. You pretty much have to rolling plan and pretty much adjust as much as you can with the capabilities you have.
Do you guys have any sort of views on sort of how you see people sort of mitigating some of these challenges? I mean, just picking up on what you said there, Henner, like the rolling idea. Is this kind of like this sort of short-term decision-making is kind of not something that's preferred in the automotive industry, in which the desire is long-term, cost-effectiveness, standardisation you mentioned there. That's had the carpet pulled out from under it there. I mean, do you see similar trends? Cengiz, you're obviously working with some of the OEMs on kind of in the sort of equipment and system supply side. Do you see similar trends? Are they looking at different ways of doing it? Are they asking for alternatives or ways of reducing their exposure?
Yes, absolutely. Fact is that availability of and the shortage of certain materials is also giving a bottleneck in equipment supply, which opens on one side opportunities for vendors to enter vendor lists which they have been not possible to in order to keep the machine going. And on the other side, it is creating also a risk factor for OEMs using this type of tested but not certified equipment in order to run their productions. So it is a mixed emotional thing in order to really satisfy the need on the demand on one side, but also, of course, not get any disruptions into manufacturing reliable equipment.
Matthias, because I don't want to go too. I know we're going to discuss with e.GO a little bit later on in the day a bit more about the business model. But your business model is a low volume sort of business case and sort of more localized supply and standardization. I mean, how do you view the sort of current sort of challenges? I mean, in terms from e.GO's point of view.
Yeah, from e.GO point of view, I will explain later a little bit what our strategy is in technology-wise, how we target that challenge, what we are doing different. Of course, we are a very small, young company in the business compared to all the other established traditional OEMs. But I spent recently this year a lot of time in Southeast Europe, where we're expanding our Microfactory network. And it's not only focusing on e.GO, but in general, we see a lot of interest from companies reshoring to Europe, their production network, from China, from Southeast Asia, basically from everywhere in the world. We see a lot of interest, especially in the Balkan area, in Bulgaria. We also see, so this is basically a supply chain effect we see here. On short term, high demand in where can I build a factory, location search. I'm very well connected in the factory planning, site selection, consulting business also, where we did before e.GO, I did a lot of site location studies where we assess all the factors. And at the moment I come out that the Southeast European region is very interesting. And also we see that some Balkan states now heading into the EU, where basically the vehicle to do that and to become part of the European Union is by creating manufacturing jobs, manufacturing value in these countries to make them a valid member or a member contributing to the EU. So these are direct effects we are seeing, or I see when I'm traveling, when I'm doing the projects in Southeast Europe. And I think this is basically because of the supply chain effects we were seeing during the last 2 years.
Yeah, reducing the exposure to that. Yeah, I mean, just going back. You mentioned you were pointing out the high costs in Europe. I mean, especially compared to the US in terms of gas. Do you see that impacting on the people reinvesting back in Europe? Do you see that slowing it down in any way? Because if you look at Europe, then it's becoming a much higher cost place to produce cars and to invest. Or is the investment long term so that wouldn't be necessarily the issue they would consider?
I think it depends on the component.
Yeah.
Right. If you have a component which is high in energy density, or you have to have a high amount of energy on the build of your component feature, you probably will reconsider because there is no end in sight. This year we still might be lucky, but what's happening next winter, the winter after, the capacities coming up is not as fast, and this is a European-wide problem. So the prices will stay high or higher. Of course, government's throwing a lot of money at it in order to mitigate. But if you're, let's say, a commodity component supplier in a plastics application, B-pillars is always my best example, and you have 5% of the manufacturing cost is the energy cost, and now you have to have 3 times. Where's your margin, right? And then you have the lower volume because you're planning on, let's say, 100,000 per year, and suddenly it's only 70,000 coming in because you're also not profiting off that. Manufacturers only bring in top-notch high-end versions, so they're making the money, but you're still the B-pillar cover provider, and then you have a problem. On the other hand, one of the issues we saw, for example, with Ukraine was wiring harness. Very, very labor-intense process, all mostly located at the border, Poland-Ukraine. So that's one, all the major ones were sitting there. This was one of the other disruptions, right? How to get people working there, how to do the logistics. There was the idea, oh, let's go all to North Africa now. And now we see that other regions where labor is the resource actually are trying to build up mitigation strategies to what Matthias said. And this is where it for sure can make sense.
Yeah, yeah. Cengiz, I mean, in terms of, are you seeing a reshoring? Are you seeing more investment from your side of things in Europe? Are you seeing much more focus here? And again, with regard to shortening supply chains?
Yeah, that's right. Not only the reshoring, but the increased level of automation in areas which has not been touched a lot in high level of automation. For example, the final assembly is something which we are seeing right now is increasing. Body in white was something which already 20 years ago there was achieved a very high level of automation, which is now brought to a level where only a couple of operators are needed to run a full body shop, including part feeding and so on and so forth. But in final assembly, there are still thousands of operators necessary because of the complexity of the assembly process, and fitting in something into an existing body shape is making the automation a little complicated. We see now a lot of investment in cobots, so collaborative operation between machine and operator, which is a first step and evolution in the area of final assembly. Having said that, further reduction of operators in the logistics of feeding materials into body in white is something where we see also a lot of activity at the moment from all kind of OEMs in order to reduce the reliability of operators, which in the last 2 years have been a weak point to keep up operations, even though if materials would have been available.
Yeah. Matthias, the business again, the sort of low volume business case and the microfactory approach to your production. Have you been, apart from the energy costs, have you been largely, does it insulate e.GO a little bit from some of the problems that the higher volume manufacturers are facing, do you think?
Yeah, so when I saw the presentation of Henner, I thought, okay, it's quite a dark picture of the automotive industry at the moment, a relatively dark outlook. But we see that completely 180 degrees different. For us, it's a very bright future, because the established rules on how the automotive industry is playing are changing even faster than we all expected during the last 10 years. So when I started 2014, the first ideas with the e.GO emerged. There were basically no electric vehicles on the road. Then they said, okay, 2020 is the goal for changing. And now it happened all in a very relatively short period of time, and dramatically. And this is basically the playing field. And you just mentioned it, especially in the small car segment, is completely, let's say, changing. It needs to change. I will come to that later. But yeah, for us, this is basically a very bright outlook as a new player in the industry, because now we can really focus on the niche, on the product we are having. We're not having all the legacy from 20, 30, 40 years of being in the industry. Yeah, And there we mentioned three very important topics already. So one is our strategy in the automotive industry when it comes to supply chain is, after 20, 30 years of extensive globalization, is it still the right strategy? Everybody is questioning that at the moment. Yeah. The second one is economies of scales. Is it still the right strategy to build always bigger factories, to look for locations where I can build the biggest factory in Europe, the biggest automotive factory, the largest battery factory? And then the third challenge is coming with the war for talents. Yeah, so when I have these very big, huge factories, I need to operate it with a certain number of operators, and I still need thousands of operators in my assembly line there. So it's connected, but for me, these are the three main challenges, and where we are fundamentally questioning about if our concepts from the last 30 years are still the concepts bringing us into the next 20 years and maintaining the position in the automotive industry. And we are coming with a completely different approach. Of course, I'm working with the company because I'm convinced that this is an approach where there is place for in the automotive industry in the future, at least in that kind of segment. And so for me, it's more a brighter future than a dark one.
Well, that's a bit of good news to start with. But it's a really interesting point you're making about sort of 30 years of globalization and global supply chains. Because one of the things that the conflict in Ukraine and the knock-on from that has kind of added, and I'll use the cliche of perfect storm for the automotive industry. If it wasn't already under pressure, then that's just added to it. But something that it made me think was, if we go back to 2008 economic crash, and a lot of the context of how the automotive industry needed to change to avoid kind of getting caught in similar traps that it did before, and things like flexibility were the big keywords then. And then we move on to COVID, we're closing factories down, furloughing people. And I just wondered, and I was always quite impressed by the response to COVID. I thought that was pretty swift and reasonably effective, and the bounce back was economic to some degree, but also the return to production wasn't as bad as we probably all expected by a stretch. And the supply chains recovered reasonably well, apart from semiconductor. But I wonder, do you think that the experience of those kind of things in recent years has improved the automotive manufacturing operations and businesses, their crisis management and resilience? Would you think that the shocks we're seeing now, even though they were very unexpected recent ones, have been slightly mitigated by the fact that they are that bit more flexible and they are able to be more agile? And do you think that's the case, or not really?
The answer is, again, it depends.
Yeah.
I think it's, if you have one of the big tankers, the traditional ones, it's very, very difficult to change it. And in the end of the day, the controller will stop by and tell you too expensive, can't do it, margins, shareholder value, and so on. Some can do it. Also, some of the bigger suppliers are struggling, but smaller ones adjusted and became more flexible. It's, of course, also then a question, how is your relationship supplier towards OEM, right? How much flexibility you have in dealing with your customer there, and the flexibility on that end to maybe claim unrealized volumes, things like that. But there's a lot of goodwill, but as I said earlier, we saw the goodwill already earlier, and even the chip crisis is not new. To the scale we're now at, it's new, and it's a little bit more accelerated because the industry still uses a lot of older chips, like 2005, 2010 generation, not the latest. And cost, again, the controller came in and said, take the cheap stuff. We have to see. I think it's too early to see how really there is a learning. Ask me in 4 or 5 years again, and then we can probably see how much really made it through and changed behaviors. Interesting enough is already in the battery area, where now more and more OEMs are getting into for example, the raw material supply chain, because they see that as a critical failure point, trying to have control over the supply chain, where the raw materials come, and doing contracts themselves with mining companies, something which hasn't happened before. The same with chips, right? Some of the bigger manufacturers trying for their suppliers doing contracts with these bigger chip suppliers. But then again, the chip supplier wants to have a 1 year pretty much pre-order with a guarantee of taking a certain amount of chips, and then Mr. or Mrs. Controller comes by and says, nope, we're not going to do that. This is not how automotive doesn't operate. And in certain areas, you see a shift, but yeah, I think to have a generalized big picture statement that everybody is now more resilient, and let's wait and see.
Because the tier suppliers are very exposed at that point, because obviously they're producing in really high volumes of smaller components. So,
Yes.
And orders are not being necessarily fulfilled, or requests are being changed. So, and quite quickly as well. And
Exactly.
I know that put a lot of them under a considerable pressure.
Yeah.
But we still see many of them still functioning and prospering and doing
And
quite
still,
well.
and this was in COVID, actually, we could react to a chip crisis, we could react to it. The difference now is the increase of interest rates. In January, there was not even the assumption out there that European Central Bank would put up interest rates.
Yeah.
So what helped through COVID and through 2021 was actually you could get easily cheap money to bridge some of these more difficult times. Now it will cost you a lot of money, the credit, depending on where you are and how you operate. So this is another additional factor onto the problem, the perfect storm, as you said it, the industry is facing right now.
I mean, in terms of changing sort of production models, so Cengiz, I know we kind of, I think we've spoken to you before, and I remember kind of, body shops, which I know is an area you work quite closely in. You look at that and they're quite big, and we saw it at BMW when we were all on the tour, very energy intensive, very, highly automated, very complex as well. I mean, that one, to be fair, there's a floor space thing there, so it makes it look more so. But I know OEMs are looking to kind of reduce the kind of footprint of those operations. And if you look at companies like e.GO, the sort of microfactory approach to things as well, there seems to be like a window of opportunity to readdress those kind of production models, not just in body shop, but in other areas as well, so that you can make them more efficient, more energy efficient, and less, I mean, it's difficult if you've already invested in the equipment, but less equipment, less CapEx heavy in that respect. I mean, do you see a trend towards that?
Yeah, I also would like to address the subject before.
Yeah.
So, yes, there is a change in the efficiency of decision-making process. Unfortunately, this crisis, there's never a good time for a crisis, don't get me wrong, but it came really to a very bad time when, especially in automotive manufacturing, new materials, new joining technologies, etc., are being introduced into the chassis of a car. Talking about wood composites, for example, returning after 80 years back into vehicles. And the part development, product development is coming up with these new architectures and materials. And right now, the level of automation is a hotspot which needs to be addressed in all kinds of areas of the automotive industry. On the other side, new materials and joining technologies also have to be addressed. And everything is coming now all together, and every OEM for itself has to set priorities. So this is priority one. Product is already finished, developed. Let's put it on the market. Or what do we do about, first of all, getting the current products on the market? Yeah, we saw during the past years a lot of shifts of project timings of new developed ready-to-go vehicles because of uncertainty of certain things in the manufacturing processes. There are a lot of movement seen now in testing and also the homologation processes of certain new joining technologies. If, for example, the cycle count which you have to achieve for getting the approval or certification for production was 200,000 cycles, 500,000 cycles. Now these cycle counts are dropped to 10,000 just to get it faster approved and into the existing processes. Now, this also has an impact on integrating new products into existing facilities versus creating smaller, like e.GO, islands where you are running one module of a certain program and with the availability of scaling it. Having said that, the highest flexible body shop is still not out of the daily discussions, because this is still the so-called holy grail. If you can have a body shop building machine, let's say, where you feed models, parts for Model A, for Model B, for Model C, and getting at the end of the line also a fully assembled Model A, B, C out, on lower footprints, less CO2 footprint in general, starting from sourcing the material down to really the consumption on the road. So all these things are now funneled, and something is coming out of the funnel, and we will see during the next couple of years, as also Henner said, what exactly will make it out of this decision-making process onto the roads and into the manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of challenges. I mean, like standardisation is quite tricky when electric vehicle technology keeps changing. If you look at battery pack sort of configurations, and the guys earlier on this morning were just discussing just the packaging of the cells is kind of at the moment keeps changing. When you look at some of the configurations of the enclosures themselves, they don't look like the final result, if you know what I mean. They're still being enhanced and refocused, and as different chemistries come along. So you've got a constantly moving technology and, by extension, production change there, which makes that nice fit of standardisation quite tricky. I mean, even at the BMW plant we saw yesterday, they're producing battery electric vehicles, hybrids and ICE cars there. And you see the different combinations. There's a huge amount of complexity there and different numbers of parts. So it just strikes you that, yes, those parts are to some degree standardised, but the actual process it's like adding in more options within the car itself, like trim options, but you've got it on a mechanical, electronic level. So standardisation becomes quite tricky. I mean, part sourcing for you, Matthias, I remember we've spoken to you a bit about like motors and batteries and things like that. Supply chain, you've been very careful about your supply chain and where you're sourcing the parts from in terms of how it fits your business model and production model. Can you just elaborate a little bit? Because you're not using the bodies are bespoke and the chassis are bespoke, but the batteries, the motors, the running gear are kind of off the shelf in that respect and so-called and standardized as such.
Yes, yeah, we will see some pictures later. We call it a smart integration. So we are not specifying a huge amount of components where we have our own requirements, put it into a 2 or 3 year development cycle for new components. We are basically providing a chassis platform, which is basically our innovation. Yeah, we bring to this project, and then we integrate off-the-shelf components. First, this sounds like a smart idea because you are participating from economies of scale without developing the components yourself. And there are a lot of components on the market, and we see that also in the supplier industry with the decreasing demand, that there is a lot of underutilized production capacity. So we expect that also suppliers might be happy in the future also to serve smaller clients. So we are not seeing a bigger dependency there. But we see the need for very flexible integration. So now you were talking also about the IRA in the US, yeah, which means especially for the battery, you need to be flexible on integrating different battery concepts in different places, yeah, or different cells from different manufacturer in different locations and regions. So this one global idea is not fitting. Maybe in the future is not valid anymore. And for that, you need to have a flexible concept which allows to integrate. It's on the BMS, on the software part, but also on the cell, on the combination with the powertrain, which goes all the way down to the ABS ESP application. Yeah, you need to have a flexible platform to integrate also new suppliers in different regions. Yeah, this is one point. But we heard the session earlier on the data level. It's basically you see the same effects on the data level. So when you are building, and we just recently announced last week our business partnership with Cybros on our global data platform. And you cannot be sure when you sell a car in China today that as a German manufacturer that tomorrow you have access to the data, or you are restricted to access the data and analyze it and combine it all data worldwide. Yeah. So what we see on the production network level, the same we see in the architecture, IT architecture level. So this is quite a challenge, which requiring for more flexible, adaptable solutions. And of course, it's not so easy when you have a lot of legacy with established manufacturing processes, a lot of capex investment. It's not so easy to adapt to new battery or new processes that easily, and requires a lot of amount of investments. Sure.
There's a question that comes out of that. I mean, just talking to you now and just listening to think. I mean, it's perhaps an unfair question, one that's been asked in the past, but the Microfactory model that a lot of the newer electric vehicle makers have adopted, given where we are now, the discussions we've been having, do we see that? I'm not saying big factories are just going to all close down, but do we see that as a growing model going forward, that we'll see a bigger expansion of that kind of production model? Do you think that, Henning? Because it seems to make sense. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, it does seem to make sense. I mean, volumes can be an issue, but I mean, what do you think? Is that?
There's definitely opportunity in this.
Yeah.
But in the end of the day, it's also about scaling and being resilient to the crisis. If you have a location where you're putting out 10, 20,000 vehicles only, and then half of it will be cut because you're in the crisis or your supplier cancels, you're of course much more affected as if you're building at a 400, 500,000 scale, 50,000, 60,000 units less, not great, but you don't immediately get into the red zone. And then the question is, how do you many need in order to then make your business case profitable? Matthias is probably going to tell us that later, how they're going to do it. But there was another player, big plans, microfactories everywhere, and what's left over, they're building, I think now, buses or vans in the US. Lots of hopes, ambitions, and then if you look at the economies of scale and the reality, it didn't really work. Theoretically, so in theory, it should be much more easy to have these micro, as Matthias said, the manufacturing landscape with the EV change, everything changed, right? So the industry is completely flipping upside down on how vehicles get assembled. You have a skateboard, you have your top hat, you can just put a little bit of software on it, you are very flexible. But this is a theory. And we have a lot of examples where it's much more difficult than anticipated to implement it like that. And again, it's a wait and see. I'm pretty sure there will be solutions which will be able to operate in that space. But will GM now switch on a microfactory setup globally? Very unlikely. Look at Tesla, right? Why are they so profitable? Because they're scaling like crazy. Right? If you think about it, it's like over 1 million Model 3, Model Y now in that category. This is beyond every established OEM's dream on platform utilization on volume. And there it's the complete opposite. The more, the better. I think there will be room for both, but in the end, also depends what market you're serving, right? Is it very specialized? Is it local? Is it small commuter vehicles, inner urban things, right? In the region, for the region? Or do you want to have your global vehicle? Which is also very difficult, because what is a global BEV these days? We used to have global platforms, global vehicles, but the requirements for electric vehicles in the US is completely different than what is in Europe and what's in China. So that's another challenge in that picture of doom. I'm apologizing to paint because it's difficult.
If you look at the electric LCV market, so the last mile delivery thing you've seen, we've yet to see the volumes being produced, but there's a huge amount of interest in that. And a lot of the newer car makers, platform builders, are targeting that at the moment. I mean, most of the big ones have kind of got some orders out there, and with some actually big fleet players as well. You know, the FedExes and the Amazons of the world. So it's interesting that they're operating relatively small manufacturing operations. So the path they will take, and they purport to have a very simple modular approach to it that's very easy to manufacture. So they don't have the legacy of complexity that the bigger car makers have with the various ranges and sophisticated stuff that they have on the cars. But it's an interesting trend and that will be at some point relatively high volume. You would think, wouldn't you? So
could yeah, because there's a different requirement for urban driving and different requirement on the vehicles. Then if you want to have private consumers who might have range anxiety, long distance driving, and also on the brand. Because one thing I think we can't forget, in the end, we can be very emotional of cars. We all love cars. We're in this industry here. Very interesting from a technology point of view. But in the end of the day, it's all about making money, as simple as it sounds, right?
Yeah.
Making money, if you have shareholders, serving these shareholders in the investment case. And this is, at the end of the day, what counts.
Just looking at now where we're at, and I've had some conversations around the event over the last couple of days, but focus of investment now. So where do we see car makers? Obviously, we saw about the investment in gigafactories this morning, but in terms of the OEMs and the tiers, where are they investing? Is it in sustainability? Is it in supply chain? We mentioned there like localizing and supporting, and we also look at BMW is probably an example of that greater level of vertical integration now. So they're building their own motors. They're looking to build their own batteries and cells at some point as well. So you're seeing what used to be production operations that have been farmed out. They were hived off as part of things. Are we seeing a return to that sort of vertical integration? Are we seeing more investment in that kind of operation? Cengiz?
A difficult question to answer.
Okay.
It is really depending on the OEM you are talking to.
Yeah.
There are different priorities on OEM sides, which are driving these kind of investments. For example, a higher sustainable product, which is forcing investment in product development. It's not only about the commercial item, it's also about everything becoming greener, and urbanization and the logistics, which has to do with the manufacturing, talking about the gigafactories versus microfactories. It doesn't make sense to have multiple press shops, just as one example. The cycle time of a press is 3 seconds. Each 3 seconds is spitting out a part. And if you have one press for one particular part in a central location and then distributing this product, let's say, out of the press to X quantity of microfactories, you are increasing the logistics on the roads, which is also counterproductive to what the world wants to achieve, getting less transportation on the roads. So there are really a lot of different views on and trends resulting. If the investment will go into higher flexible manufacturing, allowing big, massive factories where 20 kilometers radius, you have every supplier producing the components for these particular models which are built into these cars, versus really the microfactories, which are also requesting logistics, which are requesting exactly the same level of supply, just on a smaller scale, distributed across Europe, for example. And these are investments which need to be taken, running costs, higher efficiencies, and all these kind of keywords and KPIs are driving decisions from OEM to OEM into different directions. So I wouldn't say that there's a really global trend. There are multiple trends depending on the OEM you're talking to.
Yeah. Right, well, that's about it for us, I'm afraid. We've covered a fair amount of ground. I've asked some relatively impossible questions, it seems. But thanks very much for your input and your insight into that. It's been really interesting. And there'll be, I think there's another session following straight on after, So thank you to Henner, to Matthias, and to Cengiz. That's been great. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.